everyone. You guys are scared of the front rows, it looks like. All right, well, welcome. As you know, the Critical Studies program brings 2 fellows to campus, one in the fall and one in the spring. These fellows are here to be part of our community, to bring you ideas that may directly inform your work, but perhaps more importantly, influence your thinking in areas that are outside your work. Joining us this semester and speaking to us tonight for his second lecture is Joseph Tanke. You have heard from Joseph in this auditorium about 1 month ago, unpacking the idea of classical aesthetics. He has also led your discussion groups following his last lecture, taking on Immanuel Kant's Critique of Judgment, Friedrich Schiller's On the Aesthetic Education of Man. The next round starts tomorrow, so if you haven't signed up for those, do so in the administration office. Joseph has also been a guest within your departments during critiques and around the kitchen table. Please invite him if you haven't already. These conversations and meals become some of the most fruitful conversations of the program, and it is how our fellows get to know you through your work, through your department, and the rhythms of the academy. As you know by now, the man to my right is Joseph Tanke, who's visiting us from the University of Hawaii in Manoa, where he is the associate professor and chair of the graduate program in philosophy. His areas of focus, and much of what he's been sharing with us this semester, are issues on aesthetics, art theory, continental philosophy, and the history of philosophy. Some of his writings include Foucault's Philosophy of Art, A Genealogy of Modernity, and Jacques Rancière's An Introduction, Philosophy, Politics, and Aesthetics. You're becoming well acquainted with one of his newest publications, an anthology of aesthetics titled The Bloomsbury Anthology of Aesthetics. Ooh, that's a tongue twister, which holds many of the essays which you've been reading in your discussion groups. Joseph Tanke is also the editor of the series for Global Aesthetic Research, which is dedicated to publishing the latest research in the field of aesthetics. He has also been at work on his own writing since he's been here. He's working on a book entitled Castles in the Sky, Aesthetics as a Philosophical Discourse. Tonight, Tanke will be taking us through the ideas of contemporary aesthetics, so here we go. Please help me welcome Dr. Joseph Tanke.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be back for the second lecture in this series. I'd like to remind you of and I have a lot to say as usual, so I'm going to just jump into it right away and actually try to stick closely to a little bit more closely to my text in the interest of time, and hopefully thereby create a little bit more room for discussion before we leave here tonight, in particular because this will be the final public lecture we have together. I want to remind you of the title of the series of lectures because it's really indicative or really attempting to capture the movement I'm trying to describe as I go from classical aesthetics, classical German aesthetics, now into contemporary aesthetics. And this pertains to the reception of the very idea of the aesthetic, which, as I described last time, is a postulate for a certain way of relating to experience, but primarily the experience is occasioned by art and nature. And tonight I'll be interested in the ways in which that idea of the aesthetic is picked up within recent writings within French philosophy, and people have picked it up and attempted to put it to use, to give it some meaning. That is to say, to put it to work in moral and political discourses. So I'm reminding you then that this is the second half, and so I didn't tell you the title. I said I need to remind you of the title of the full lectures, and I didn't say the title. It's there on your handout, The Audacious Idea of the Aesthetic, Entropy in 2 parts, because what I'm trying to move you to is an appreciation of some of the chaotic energy that's built up in the original kernel of the idea of the aesthetic, which at various points is contained and put to use in the construction of a theoretical discourse on art, or a theoretical discourse on ethics, or a theoretical discourse on politics, but which it is worth considering to what extent a retrieval of that initial chaotic energy might be beneficial to us today. And that's the question I'll leave us with. So as I begin, then, I'm reminding you that we are encountering the second half of a 2-part conversation that we began over a month ago. And tonight's lecture on contemporary aesthetics is a critical overview of the way in which the idea of the aesthetic that we developed last time has been appropriated for various ethical and political projects. By this, I do not mean to suggest that I'm here interested in the recent ethical and political employments of art. These practices, as I see them, have as their historical precondition the transformation of the concept of art that was achieved by philosophical aesthetics. Specifically, in the idea that art is capable of being more than simply an element in religious pedagogy or a means of representation, whether of someone or of the world, or the simple depiction of objects. It's these ideas which then make it possible for us to then see it as commonsensical that art could be used to repair ethical and political problems. And so I'm interested in the way in which, within the tradition of philosophical aesthetics, these ideas begin to take root. And for various reasons that I'll explain, I want to resist some of them. So here, rather, I'm interested in the ways in which the postulate of the aesthetic experience, an experience that, as we saw last time, was defined in terms of its difference, in terms of its separation from cognition and morality, nevertheless comes to be outfitted with moral and political significance. Specifically, I will look at the connections articulated between the aesthetic and the ethical, as it was developed in the writings of Jean-François Lyotard, and then the connections between aesthetics and the political, as described by Jacques Rancière in his most recent writings which are still appearing, which are still coming out. Both of these projects, I hope to show you, in some way repeat the tendencies already underway in the aftermath of the publication of Kant's Critique of Judgment in 1790. Here I'm speaking specifically of the attempts to reconnect the aesthetic after that separation from morality and cognition to morality and politics, after Kant's insistence upon a specifically aesthetic form of liking. After looking at these contemporary projects, I will return to the more indeterminate and, to my mind, radical idea of the aesthetic that we saw in Kant's Critique of Judgment, and I hope suggest to you its promise for art today. As I told you last time, my argumentative strategy is far from complex. It simply consists of asking a simple, small, innocuous question. How can that which has been defined in terms of its difference from cognitive and moral evaluation, that is to say the aesthetic, ever be assigned a straightforward, unambiguous meaning? In fact, I wonder if what we see in the idea of the aesthetic is not the idea of an experience that is resistant to meaning as such. By way of contrast with Lyotard and Rancière, then, I argue that due to its removal from the moral and cognitive domains of human experience, it is difficult to say much, if anything, about the aesthetic, and that such an experience will always be at odds with a straightforward moral or political appropriation. And thus that any moral and political lessons that we may draw from art and artistic practice will always be indirect. The aesthetic, then, as I will come to understand it in the closing part of my lecture, is a prompting, a reminder of our freedom, but it contains no direct lessons for how life should be lived, and I don't even think it tells us what direction art should take, and that, I'm going to suggest to you, is a virtue. So, if you like, you might think about these two lectures as telling a story. At least that's how I try to conceive of them, as having something of a narrative arc to them. A story about the birth, development, appropriation, and potential legacy of an idea, an audacious idea at that. The idea is that art is experienced within a sensual, contemplative space that cannot be reduced to questions about truth or morality. That space is called aesthetic because even though rational thought is present, sensuousness is foregrounded, feeling is foregrounded. That space, as we saw last time, is created by taking things up from a slightly different angle, such as when we ask the question, is it pleasing? The aesthetic is created by the recognition that while truth and morality are important aspects of human life, they can hardly be said to constitute the final word on experience, and that it is still necessary to consider whether a given form of appearances occasions pleasure, and if so, why? And that is the central question of aesthetics. So this position that I'm assigning to the lecture is summarized in the first point that I gave you on the handout. I won't always gesture towards the handout so much, but what I've tried to do is think about tonight's lecture as unfolding in 9 major points, which I've summarized for you on there. So that is the first point. Now moving on to what's encapsulated in the second point. 2 reminders about what we did last time to better understand what I'll be doing tonight. The first pertains to how we can understand the relationship between art and aesthetics. As you know, I'm not here speaking directly about works of art and then attempting to make arguments on behalf of cultural forms that I find to be moving, important, historically significant, or whatever else. Instead, I'm seeking to analyze the framework that supplies for us an idea of what art is, what it is capable of, and how it relates to other aspects of human life, and then the justifications given for why it's important. For the past 200 or so years, aesthetics is the conversation that has allowed us to distinguish the objects and experience claimed as art from the rest of everyday object and experience. Aesthetics is the series of practical and philosophical assumptions by means of which we identify certain objects, experiences, and even ideas as art. This is why, despite the fact that I'm not speaking directly of works of art, I nevertheless believe that everything I have to say about aesthetics is immediately relevant for students of art and design. What I'm trying to analyze is the very framework, the very logic, the very series of assumptions by which we have come to classify and distinguish certain objects or experiences and ideas as art and distinguish them from others which are not art. Second reminder, which pertains to my definition of aesthetics, which you all know and love by this point. Aesthetics is the discourse, the theoretical discourse that is used in the analysis of art or special instances of the natural world. As such, it attempts to exacerbate, or at least make us more attentive to the differences between art and everyday life. Aesthetics is a form of thought that cultivates in us an appreciation for all of the ways in which art is different from everything else in the world. And it can only do this on the understanding that it is capable of in some way telling us what art is, as well as what unique forms of experience it is capable of engendering. And so what I'm suggesting is that that word aesthetics is be used to refer to the theoretical conversation regarding art, the experience of beauty, the experience of the sublime, and the experience associated with it, which is named the aesthetic or the aesthetic experience. This is summarized in point 2. Last bit about this. As you know, I think many confusions in discussions of contemporary art today could be avoided by reserving the word aesthetics and the aesthetic to designate these 2 concerns, and that our conversations would become richer if we refrain from using those words too loosely, such as when we mistakenly refer to a work's formal properties as its aesthetics. Okay. Now I'll move into the way in which this idea, which I talked about in quite a lot of detail last time, has been picked up and put to use, appropriated, and attempted, and in which a moral and political discourses have been attempted to be generated out of it. Recent efforts within the field of European philosophy, and I'm here speaking largely about the French philosophical context tonight, have attempted to come to terms with the historical and philosophical significance of the advent of aesthetics. Thinkers within this tradition have explored what they view as the changing system of values ushered in by the age of aesthetics, along with its import for our understanding of art. And indeed, it's striking to me the way in which both Lyotard and Rancière at points both present the aesthetic as a type of thoroughgoing form of revolution within culture which fundamentally alters what can be seen, experienced, and understood as art. You see this, for example, in the Leotard text where he's analyzing Barnett Newman's text, The Sublime Is Now, and reading symptomatically almost the number of paintings in which Newman alludes to the sublime. And Leotard is puzzled by what he sees as the somewhat unlikely reemergence of this forgotten cultural modality, the sublime. And this is really what prompts that essay and quite a lot of thinking on Leotard's part about the significance and potential import of the sublime. Leotard saw the development of the sublime as a turning point in the history of art, in that it put in place a series of assumptions which allowed for artists to break with neoclassical aesthetics and the concern for the beautiful, the concern for pleasing, unified forms. And thus, for Lyotard, the shift from an aesthetics of the beautiful to an aesthetics of the sublime is really what's at the root of both modernism and postmodernism. For Lyotard, the sublime occasioned the emergence of a more shocking and, as he will argue in many places, more ethically responsive form of art. This moves us into point 3, and here I just have a couple of questions that might have occurred to you. Namely, what is it that is important about the sublime for someone like Lyotard, and why is the sublime, with its long and complicated textual history, something that a late 20th century thinker would seek to reintroduce into discussions of avant-garde art? At the very least, you might think maybe it's a little foolhardy to be developing these notions from the 18th century for use in the analysis of works of art in the late 20th century, which is what Lyotard was doing. And so to think about these questions, like what is it that Lyotard wants to take from the sublime, I suggest we have to think about his two major sources on the sublime, because that's not an accident, and look at what he takes from each of them. So to answer these questions, we should look at two of the major sources that Lyotard draws upon, namely Burke and Kant. With Burke, Lyotard finds a way to radicalize the sublime, and so to turn art into an ever more startling and shocking event. For Burke, the sublime was above all an experience of terror. And Lyotard leans on Burke in order to conceptualize that terror that seizes us when we attend to the radically contingent nature of art, the fact that it might not have been and that it could easily cease at any moment. With Kant, Lyotard inherits a long line of thought that views the experience of the sublime as harboring an intimate connection with morality. And this is going to be the one that's more important for what I have to say tonight. Whereas for Kant, the beautiful was an experience of pleasure, the sublime is an admixture of pain and pleasure. And this is important. This is the chief way in which I think many people today would still distinguish between the affect associated with the beauty and the experience associated with the sublime. Namely that whereas the beautiful is pleasing, the sublime is an admixture of pain and pleasure, or a type of pleasure taken in displeasure. For Kant, and Kant's very technical, and I'm going to go through some of this quickly, but I think it's important that you know, you've read part of it, and I think it's important that you know the story Kant tells about the sublime and why it is that it's capable of inducing both pain and then pleasure. For Kant, the displeasure that is felt in the sublime is the result of the sensuous faculty, that is to say, the imagination, having been carried to its limits by means of a prompting from something excessively large or excessively powerful as it is found within the natural world. Reason, the rational faculty, demands from the imagination that it produce a unified, thinkable totality. But the imagination falters when encountering something that outstrips its presentational powers, thus resulting in a feeling of displeasure. This gap between the demand of reason on the one hand for a unified totality, a unified thinkable whole, and the capacities of the imagination, which are taken to their limit by means of something excessively large or excessively powerful in the natural world, gives rise to an experience of what Lyotard terms the unpresentable. The point is not all that difficult. Reason is capable of generating ideas for which there is no possible presentation, or for which no presentation could ever be adequate. And so in the sublime experience, what you have is simultaneously the feeling of imagination coming to its limits and thus experiencing a type of displeasure in that recognition, and an awakening in reason, an awakening in the mind of an awareness that reason surpasses sense, surpasses a determination by means of the natural world. And that is not insignificant, to learn that there's something in you or in the mind or in the human person which is not completely governed and determined by the natural world, because that's the source of our freedom, and ultimately for Kant, a type of proof that we are capable of morality. As is well known, for Kant, the sublime is the primary way in which the mind learns that it possesses within itself a capacity that surpasses determination by sense, That is, that the faculty of reason is not limited and bounded by the natural world as it is conveyed to the mind by means of the imagination, but instead is itself the source of ideas and values that could not have come from the natural world. It is the means by which the human being learns that he or she is in possession of a faculty that surpasses even the largest and most powerful experiences to be found in the natural world. Thus, with the sublime, what the human person learns is that he or she is free to act, or not, for the sake of duty, inasmuch as he or she finds within him or herself a capacity that surpasses sensible determination. This discovery, the second moment, the discovery of reason, in sublime experience is what's responsible for the production of pleasure and a type of corresponding elevation of the mind. You have all of this very adroitly summarized for you in point number 3. But let me summarize one more time. There's a double movement, basically, in the sublime, or in the feelings associated with the sublime. The imagination comes to its limits, falters, and this induces a momentary sensation of displeasure when our capacity for unifying the world of sense is taken to its limits. In the second moment, there's the discovery of a faculty not governed by sensation, not governed by the natural world, in fact, capable of surpassing the natural world, which results in a feeling of pleasure and which produces within us this elevating experience whereby we discover the mind's, quote, supersensible vocation. That's Kant's word for supersensible vocation, is Kant's way of describing this ability of reason to transcend determination by means of the natural world, or determination by the natural world. And thus, the discovery within itself that we can give to the natural world standards. This is our capacity for morality and our recognition that it's possible to live according to what ought to be rather than according to what simply is. Moving on to point number 4. Leotard uses these two ideas of the sublime, Kant and Burke, in order to attempt to develop a form of thinking ever more sensitive to that which resists conceptualization. So remember that Leotard will be interested in this gap, or in this break between imagination and reason, or to that with respect to reason which remains unpresentable, that which the imagination can never supply to reason. He picks up on Kant's idea that the sublime experience is born of the failure of the imagination to present to reason a unified image that would be adequate to its reason's demands for totality. In this way, the sublime becomes for Lyotard the reminder that there is something within experience that eludes complete and total presentation in thought. Said another way, the sublime, as Lyotard understands it, was one of the places within Western philosophical thought wherein that thought was attempting to remain sensitive to that which eludes it. In this respect, Lyotard's redeployment of the sublime within contemporary conversations regarding art and aesthetics was a way of seeking to curb the totalizing pretensions of Western philosophical thought through the development of what we might call an ethics for thought. But by being brought into contact with discussions of the European avant-garde, it was also a way of attempting to create a specifically ethical function for art. Now, Lyotard is well known for this distinction between modern art and postmodern art, or modernism and postmodernism, and I'm going to look at this discussion. It's important to remember that both of these are, for Lyotard, arts occasioned by the sublime, or occasioned by a shift to an aesthetics of the sublime. For Lyotard, postmodern art bears witness to the unpresentable that exists within thought, to the fact that thought is already forgetful of the otherness that provided it with the impetus to thought in the first place, and thus always in some way inadequate to that which is in need of thinking. Certain contemporary practices, Lyotard thinks, can move us to be more mindful of that which resists representation. The ethical stakes of the avant-garde, and he's speaking directly about avant-garde art, are thus bound up with this idea of bearing witness to the unpresentable, without at the same time in any way pretending to be adequate to or equal to the unpresentable. In the well-known text from 1982 answering the question, what is postmodernism, Lyotard attempted to articulate the subtle differences that he thinks distinguish modern from postmodern art. Lyotard describes both the modern and postmodern in terms of the Kantian sublime. That is, as efforts to put forward the fact that the unpresentable exists. The key difference is that modern art holds out hope for joining together the ideas of reason with their material presentation. And here I'll quote Lyotard on the subject of modern art. It allows for the unpresentable to be put forward only as missing contents, but the form, because of its recognizable consistency, continues to offer the reader or viewer matter for solace and pleasure. There's a type of nostalgia within, Lyotard thinks, within modernism, which holds out hope that someday thought will be adequate, or art will be adequate to the challenge of the unpresentable. Postmodern artists, on the other hand, deny viewers the solace of good forms and deny them the possibility of nostalgia. Instead, they devote the work of artistic work to putting forward in presentation the fact that the unpresentable exists, and do so without generating nostalgia for its full and adequate presentation. In artistic terms, this amounts to disrupting the modernist desire for order, totality, and completion. Positively, for Leotard, this means that art should not have the hubris to attempt to name the unnameable, but rather say what it cannot say. Art must therefore renounce its claims to representation and seek out new ways of revealing that every representation is condemned to a forgetting, the presence of the other, the trauma of an event that is constitutive of thought itself, and only able to be remembered as forgotten. The sublime is thus, for Leotard, one of the few places within Western culture where philosophical thought and artistic practice have attempted to come to terms with their own limits and necessary exclusions. It provides us with a means of gesturing towards that which eludes thought and that which, under the name of an obligation to the other, must nevertheless be thought. What I'm calling your attention to here, all too briefly, is the way in which the aesthetics of the sublime becomes for Leotard a way of assigning to art an ethical role. This ethics is perhaps best understood as an ethics of memory. Art reminds us of that which would otherwise be forgotten as a result of the totalizing pretensions of Western philosophical, technological, and artistic thought. Art may thereby render us more sensitive to the blind spots within thought, and in turn render us more sensitive to that which is always already condemned to being forgotten. What I'm stressing here by way of a critique of Leotard is the way in which the separation that defined the aesthetic in terms of its basic difference from morality has come to be overwritten with a story about the essentially ethical nature of the aesthetic experience as such. So what I'm saying is that I think Leotard is tying his ethics too closely to the nature of the aesthetic experience as such, and thereby destroying what was unique about it in the first place, namely that it was the idea of a form of evaluation independently of considerations of good and evil, truth and falsity. While Kant himself offers a long account of how in sublime experience the supposed failure of the imagination and eventual triumph of reason enabled the human person to discover the source and locus of morality, he was careful never to ascribe moral significance directly to the sublime. By the time we get to Leotard, however, the indeterminacy of the aesthetic experience, along with the freedom it was said to occasion, has been overwritten with an ethics of witnessing. Or perhaps more generously, one might say that the indeterminacy of the aesthetic has been seized upon and outfitted with a narrative that assigns to art the task of cultivating indeterminacy for some very determinate end. That is, the cultivation of an ever more ethical form of thought that would be more and more sensitive to the stirrings of otherness. So what I'm suggesting is that the indeterminacy of the aesthetic, which was said to resist or at least trouble meanings, has been assigned a very direct meaning by the time we get into the writings of Leotard. We can see in the recent work of Jacques Rancière a similar overwriting of the aesthetic, the form of experience that with Kant we saw to be distinguishable from cognitive and moral concerns, and here we move to point 6. Rancière's contribution, as I see it, consists of offering an appealing and compelling interpretation of the text of classical aesthetics as being essentially about the creation of a sensible form of equality. And it's this concept, this idea of a sensible form of equality that I'm going to return to in a number of ways, because this is essential for, as I see it, this is essential for the type of political significance that Rancière wants to ascribe to the aesthetic. Namely, he will see it as the creation of a real palpable form of equality which carries with it a political significance. For many, Rancière's contribution is both timely and original, perhaps for the simple reason that aesthetics has long been thought of as, at best, an unpolitical way of looking at art, one that describes the internal relationships between the formal elements of a given work, or at its worst, an elitist and or Eurocentric way to approach artistic products. For many years now, it has been common for many in the arts to think of aesthetics, when they think of it at all, as at best naive, and Rancière has done us a great service by revitalizing aesthetics and pointing to its intersections with contemporary cultural production. Rancière's major idea is that art is not autonomous from the other aspects of existence, as so many misleading theories of modernism have held. Artistic practices redefine what can be seen and said, as well as the implicit estimations placed upon members of our communities. In the more technical language that Rancière has developed, art is one of the primary means by which the, quote, distribution of the sensible, his concept for the distribution of bodies, voices, roles, and occupations at work within a given society, comes to be altered and reconfigured. So art is essentially for Rancière thinkable as that which contributes to, but also critiques and alleviates and redistributes the sensible configuration of our society, both the sphere of appearances and the meanings assigned to that which appears. It is important to stress that the intertwining of art and politics, or art and the distribution of the sensible, that Rancière describes is not the same as the customary postmodern thesis about the blurring of the boundaries between art and life. For Rancière, aesthetics defines an identity of art in which art's power is contained in its difference from the everyday, not its identification with it. That is, art harbors propositions for other ways of life and thus has a type of political agency inasmuch as it refuses to be directly inserted into everyday systems of meaning. That is, inasmuch as it refuses to be explicitly political and inasmuch as it stages its difference from life as art. So what Rancière has given us is an ability to think about how art as art nevertheless maintains some indirect connections with the rest of life, and to get the type of ethical, political, social contestatory force out of art that many people would like. It's not necessary for those artistic practices to necessarily be actively working on the boundary of art and life. As framed and shaped by the discourse of aesthetics, they already do that. Point number 7. Essential then for understanding Rancière's account of how aesthetics can have this political capacity is to recognize that the aesthetic experience is fundamentally different from everyday experience. And this is a distinction we looked at last time when we looked at the difference between the aesthetic and cognition. Here we can notice that Rancière's argument is reliant upon the very same heterogeneity between the aesthetic and the cognitive that I pointed to in the first lecture on Kant. And one of Rancière's primary arguments on behalf of the politics of aesthetics will consist of assigning political significance to this rupturing of experience, of the replacement of everyday cognition with an idle, disinterested thought that seeks nothing beyond itself. And this is his way of understanding the aesthetic. It's a type of idleness, a type of disinterestedness. It's a type of thought that doesn't seek for anything beyond itself. And this difference carries with it a type of political charge. Generally speaking, cognition is the name for the relationship between sense and reason that exists as we go about our normal, everyday task of attempting to understand the world, looking for a container of milk in the supermarket, for example. As we saw, in cognition, sense is subordinated to reason, with reason supplying the final word regarding the meaning of experience, this is milk. In the aesthetic experience, sense and reason enter into a free relationship wherein they engage one another in a type of reciprocal free play. This free play frees up the sensuous side of the human person from concerns and constraints that typify cognition. The question, is it pleasing, here produces another relation to the content of one's own experience, liberating it, one's experience, from the demands of truth and morality. Kant described this free play of the imagination and understanding as an instance of quickening to indicate that, somewhat paradoxically, the mind finds a type of satisfaction in the indeterminacy that is prompted by art. The point is that, for many aestheticians, there was said to be a profoundly new relationship between sense and reason in the aesthetic experience, one which, according to someone like Schiller, signaled the potential emancipation of the human person more generally. In a very important book, Aesthetics and Its Discontents, Rancière draws what he thinks is an obvious political conclusion about the arrangement of the cognitive faculties in aesthetic experience. Following Schiller, he claims that this new relationship between sense and reason carries a political promise, and a specifically political promise, because it is the intimation of a world without hierarchy. Specifically, Rancière sees in the free play of sense and reason an equality between sense and reason. And it's to this which he ascribes a democratic political significance. This is that sensible form of equality that I was talking about, right? That in the aesthetic experience, Rancière thinks that what you have between sense and reason is the experience of equality. And there's so much in our daily life set up to deny the experience of equality that this should be startling to us, he thinks. Thus, in contrast with the everyday condition of the mind, the aesthetic offers us a glimpse of emancipation, inasmuch as emancipation is, for Rancière, synonymous with a specifically democratic form of politics, that is, with the assumption and continual verification of radical intellectual equality. It is in this way that, for Rancière, the aesthetic and aesthetics comes to carry an explicitly political meaning. Not so unlike the Kantian story about the sublime being the place wherein the human mind discovers its freedom from determination, and thus its capacity for morality, the aesthetic is the place where, for Rancière, the human mind discovers the value of equality, and thus its capacity for politics. So we'll move into now points 8 and 9, in which I will begin to offer a criticism of Rancière and Lyotard's positions by way of setting the stage for my own position and begin to conclude. While I'm generally sympathetic to Rancière's analyses of the democratic features of aesthetics, I think he overstates the case for the politics of aesthetics when he identifies the aesthetic experience with the experience of equality. I find it necessary to complicate his picture by pointing to some of the more disquieting aspects of aesthetics. Primarily, this consists of reminding ourselves that rather than lending itself to an uncomplicated theory of democratic sensibility, aesthetics has at points divided the world into two, instituting hierarchies on the basis of capacities for sense and reason. In contrast with Rancière, I think what we see in the history of aesthetics is a constant oscillation between, on the one hand, conceptions of judgment premised upon equality, and on the other hand, the creation of an aristocracy of sense, with a dividing line separating those noble souls capable of being moved by the mysteries of art and nature from the vulgar masses upon whom they are lost. Often, these contradictory impulses are contained within the same thinker. Even Schiller, ostensibly the most democratic of the post-Kantian aesthetic thinkers, claims that there are those who are suited for, quote, subordinate occupations, as opposed to those who are, quote, destined for distinguished roles in life. And he bases this distinction on the basis of a type of capacity for the holistic contemplation required by the boundlessness of the aesthetic. Now, he hides this away in a footnote to the 21st letter, but it's there nevertheless. While the aesthetic may be the source and locus of the democratic values that Rancière points to, the aesthetic has been described as a type of proving ground wherein sensitive souls demonstrate that they are capable of the disinterestedness said to constitute the appropriate attitude for art. In short, the aesthetic is an indeterminate, or at best polyvalent phenomenon capable of carrying a number of contradictory meanings. However desirable it may be to see the aesthetic as that which is capable of generating an ethics of thought, or as a sensible form of equality that may contribute to the struggles for human emancipation, it is important to remember that the aesthetic is also an intoxicating vertigo, which emboldens the cognitive faculties and convinces them of their superiority over the rest of nature. The aesthetic, lest we forget, also carries the name of Dionysus, provides the perceptual intellectual soil for the thinking of the overman, and in the case of French Romanticism, leads to the valorization of decadence and evil. Because of this oscillation, I am inclined to locate the significance of the aesthetic elsewhere. Rather than ask what the aesthetic means, we should ask what its postulation does, has done, and can do for us once again today. It is not a phenomenon to which we can assign any one meaning without destroying what was unique about it in the first place. In this respect, I think the projects of Lyotard and Rancière run into difficulty when they attempt to speak of the aesthetic experience as though it could mean one thing. Can one say unequivocally that the aesthetic is an instance of equality without thereby closing down upon the mind's freedom? That is, without betraying the indeterminacy of sense that was the source of its freedom in the first place? Can one say that it is the duty of art to stir our appreciation for the otherness that is foreclosed upon in most other forms of thought, without thereby also foreclosing upon other directions for art? Aesthetics postulates the idea of a new form of experience, one whose advent is replete with philosophical and practical consequences, inasmuch as it is the idea of an experience unmoored from the limits of cognition and the dictates of morality. Unlike Lyotard and Rancière, who want the aesthetic to mean something, it is perhaps necessary to remind ourselves that ultimately the aesthetic means nothing. The aesthetic is a tremendous void with respect to the rest of experience, a rupturing of meaning that is not, for all that, without practical significance, particularly when it comes to the arts. As I have already indicated, the entropy produced by this void is not to be feared. It is the productive space into which the arts have stepped for the past 200 or so years. If everything is true, then nothing is possible. The aesthetic is the untruth, or better still, the throwing off of the expectation that everything need be true or false, good and evil. In this respect, the aesthetic is that which restores to thought the possibility of truth and morality, even though in and of itself it cannot be true or moral. And for this reason, it is the means by which art might once again rediscover its innocence. Because the ethics and politics of aesthetics are far from direct and straightforward, I think it more accurate to describe any ethical and political positions that may be generated from aesthetics as stemming from the suspension, withdrawal, and decentering prompted by the aesthetic experience. The aesthetic is the moment of withdrawal that renders us foreign to ourselves, inhospitable to the world as it has been constituted, and hostile to anything incompatible with the mind's freedom. But it does not tell us what things mean, what we ought to do, or what direction art should take. Moving to point 9. The aesthetic is a deeply ambiguous retreat from the habitual meanings that are assigned to sense, or if you like, it is a breakdown of the sense, that is, meanings typically assigned to that which appears before our senses. Aesthetics insists that there are objects, moments, gestures, or scenes, whether occasioned by art or nature, that are incapable of being exchanged because they are, quote, valuable on their own terms and for their own sake. Such experiences, described frequently as play, depart from the dominant understanding of existence according to which everything must serve some end external to itself. Aesthetics insists upon enjoying experiences for their own sake, without putting them to work, making them turn a profit, or even asking what they mean. This is the subtle subversion that was contained in the seemingly innocuous question, is it pleasing? That question makes it possible to uncouple our sense for a thing, our sensing of a thing, an art object, an experience, a scene from the natural world, from the cognitive and moral senses, that is, meanings frequently ascribed to it, So what I'm pointing to here is the separation of sense from sense, of meaning from sensation that goes on in the aesthetic experience. Whereas in most forms of experience, the sense as meaning is very closely tied to that which is present before our senses. In the aesthetic, there is a much more indeterminate relationship between the two, and this is the ground. This is what constitutes the possibility of this play. Nearly every post-Kantian aesthetician saw the aesthetic and aesthetics as a means to some end, whether that of political reform, Schiller, a way to obtain new cognitive insights into the development of world historical spirit, Hegel, the sensation of suffering caused by desire, Schopenhauer, the ethical reminder of thought's indebtedness to the other, Lyotard, or the furtherance of projects for human emancipation, Rancière. Without these various attempts to ascribe ethical and political significance to the aesthetic, it would be hard to imagine what art would be today. What aesthetics has created is a series of expectations regarding what art is and what it is capable of. And it is difficult to imagine artists using their practices to address social, political, ethical, and practical problems without the transformations that aesthetics carried out with respect to our concept of art well over 100 years ago. Without such speculations, it is fair to say art could not have come to occupy the privileged role that it has in our world today, one wherein it is expected to facilitate directly such transformations. However, it is fair to ask to what extent these expectations have come to function as stumbling blocks and thus obstacles to new and otherwise unimagined possibilities for art today. In my thinking, I've sought to resist the temptation to assign to the aesthetic, and thus to art, any one meaning or direction. In this respect, my return to Kant is intended to trouble the implicit forms of justification and thus directions that have been built into our understanding of art. Paradoxical as it may sound, it is the attempt to cultivate an idea of art that could not in any way be taken as normative, foundational, or prescriptive. It is the attempt to restore to art the sense of radical possibility that was born on that day in 1790 when the experience of art was separated from truth and morality. Thank you. So I'd be happy to take your questions. Or not. Please.
I forgot exactly where you were talking about. I guess you were talking about the aesthetics as like the aesthetic as perceived as I forgot. But I was wondering if you could talk more about Leotard talked about it a little bit, and I said we have to that you guessed it. I was wondering if you could talk more about the relationship of the aesthetic to like capitalism. You know, because I feel like specifically what Kant talks about like this. These things are like he's talking about nature. We're talking about things that are like so large that your mind can't deal with it. But like to do things like that as an artist requires like a lot of money. You know what I mean? Sometimes and I guess I'm just wondering if you could talk about that. I feel like I guess I'm just interested.
Well, you kind of give me a very broad way to go at this. And there are a number of, I could sit here like everybody and complain about the pernicious role of capitalism on the production of art and lament how terrible it is that people have to make things for a market, but I'm not going to do that. And instead what I try to do in my thinking is identify something that can never be co-opted, even if the worst picture about the complicity between art and capital holds true. And that's, I think, what we find in the texts of classical aesthetics, and I think also what you find in the thinking of someone like Lyotard, is an interest in something which is not commodifiable, a certain relationship with art or with the natural world that that insists on value for its own sake, or something which is valuable in its own right, which is not synonymous with its price, which is in fact resistant to its price. Is there something specific, more specific you'd like to ask?
I don't know, I guess I just feel like the resistance to talk about like actual work of force of art. I feel like we're talking about like the aesthetic of like this like the suitcase of Pulp Fiction and like dancing around or something, And I feel like obviously you don't have to. It sounds like I'm trying to go to this place where like, oh, like, tell me what to do, man. But it's not your job. It's not what I'm asking. I just feel like there's like not impracticality, but it's like it makes it like the discussion makes it about the aesthetic, And I guess I'm curious about how to make it like to uncouple the not like the aesthetic, but the actual discussion from like the narrative of postmodern, like postmodern modern art is problematic.
Would it be helpful to return to the notion of quality here?
Yeah.
Where you talked about that might
What is the notion?
notion of quality?
Equality.
Can I tack something onto that? The word balance kept coming up for me in thinking about equality or the relationship between sense and reason. Does balance come in there at all? Because equality seems like a really strange, like there's so many factors that get like mixed up in equality that I don't know, for some reason balance seems like a more
Yeah.
fruitful platform, maybe? Is that at all relevant to that?
Well, in as much as it matters greatly the names that we put on things, the names that we assign to given phenomena, because they have they define the limits of what we can see and say, like the names that we give to things, and they always have a type of ethics and politics built into them. And so, if we call the relationship between imagination and understanding as it exists in this experience, or as it's articulated in these texts, equality, that's very helpful to creating a link between aesthetics and politics, and a specifically democratic form of politics. And then the historical point that I made last time is that the reason why a lot of these notions are being developed in the way that they are, when they are, is because people are concerned about the relationship between art and capital, and trying to identify forms of experience that cannot be reduced to that relationship. If you say that there's a type of balance between the imagination and understanding, that's maybe a way of, Rancière would accuse you of trying to skirt the unavoidable connection between aesthetics and politics, or diffuse it. And we would ask, what's the motivation for that, right? The one problem I have with it, just as a reader of these texts, is it seems to flatten what's a very dynamic relationship between those faculties. There's a play there, almost like a tug of war, in which they're going back and forth. And so balance seems to imply a type of stasis, and I don't think that's exactly accurate as well.
I have a quick question. You said, and I can't remember which direction it went, and whether you said more Eurocentric or less Eurocentric as we move between points like 5 and 6, between Leotard and Rancière. And until we really get to 9, when you're talking about kind of your own understanding of this radical openness or kind of sense of the aesthetic.
Yeah.
Could you go back a little bit and talk about how we're either moving towards or away, because all of it sort of fits. I'm having a hard time fitting conditioning to some extent and finding a place where it separates. It seems very universal where I'm having a hard time actually identifying that. It's when you're talking about it kind of moving forward or away from a culture, I'm sort of interested in that.
The reference to Eurocentrism was just me alluding to a common criticism of aesthetics as just that, as being a Eurocentric approach to art, because all of the thinkers associated with it, particularly if you take a very limited view of aesthetics and just look at where the word is used, it's 18th, 19th, and 20th century Europe and North America, and so it seems to have this constraining, restricting, and maybe exclusionary sense to it, right? It defines some people would say it defines a rather privileged relationship with the work of art, wherein we're supposed to be spectators and we're supposed to be disinterested, and it's very much codifying the type of art that or type of relationship you would have with art and the type of art that you would have in museum and gallery institutions. And I'm just suggesting that while there may be some things to be gained from those types of criticism, they don't enable us to thoroughly discount, and they certainly don't exhaust the nature and meaning of aesthetics. That's all I was saying with that point. But you have something more in mind.
No, that's helpful, because like I think part of my issue with like the idea of like how some of this has been talked about is the idea that like it seems like conditioning is irrelevant, where I feel like when you talk about things like the sublime or an aesthetic experience, like conditioning, regardless of like moral implication, religious implication, I think conditioning just like inherently defines how we interact with the world, and so I felt like that was kind of missing in some of like the previous conversations, which is what I was sort of asking about.
No, it's all over the place. I want to ask what you mean by conditioning, but
I think I think specifically from, like there's all sorts of ways to take it, whether it's like socioeconomic or whatever, but I think specifically in a global sense, I think cultures inherently embed certain ideas of maybe what like sublimity or like any of those things would be, and so I think that like it's hard to understand the like aesthetic, art experience as a universal complete,
okay. So one of the reasons why I call the aesthetic an audacious idea is because it postulates the possibility of separating one's experience, that is to say one's judgment of a thing, from one's conditioning. Like it holds out the possibility that we are capable of recognizing the ways in which we are culturally determined, culturally positioned by means of economics, geography, national identities, kinds of things, and facing up to those things, owning up to those things, and ultimately separating our experience from them. I don't think we want to go down the road of saying all of our judgments, and that is to say all of our experiences are completely, totally culturally determined, which I think is the outcome of a lot of that line of thinking that most people stumble into. Aesthetics postulates that it's at least possible to recognize and diffuse those influences at some point. But I'm sympathetic to what you say, and one of the reasons why I spend so much time with the history of these ideas is to look precisely at the ways in which a given culture has created them for itself discursively. I'm not claiming that these notions, beauty, sublimity, the aesthetic, exist anywhere absolutely. I'm saying that these are expectations for our experience of art, of culture, that have been created by means of these texts, which we inherit as a type of cultural resource that we inherit, and asking the question what in it is worth taking and what in it needs to be criticized and set aside for right now. And what I like about the Kantian picture of the aesthetic is the sense of radical possibility that I see in that text. This sort of shirking and throwing off of all these expectations for what art ought to be, art ought to be and ought to be doing, that we get from so many forms of art theory and many art historical endeavors, which don't really honestly announce their prescriptive and normative intentions.
I had a question again about Kant's idea of the sublime.
Yeah.
Specifically, so we start with imagination taken to its limits.
Right.
And at the same time, reason wanting sort of totality and understandable. So first you have imagination, sort of this oceanic feeling, even like taken to so much that you can't understand it, right? And then, because we're
Um, the sense that reason is surpassing the natural world, and Kant doesn't have our strong environmentalist sensibilities, so he's not at all hesitant to say is superior to the natural world. Like he thinks rational nature is the highest thing that exists in the world. Very Enlightenment conception of reason that he's working with. The reason that's already implicit in the idea of a unified totality or of totality. Some of the ideas that reason is bringing to experience as an expectation, which could not have come from experience itself. Where in the natural world do you have an experience of totality? Where in the natural world do you have an experience of the world? You don't, strictly speaking, have that experience. Those are ideas of reason supplied by reason. And what the sublime does is allow for reason to sort of become conscious of the gap it's instituting with respect to that which can come from the senses. And so there's a type of becoming self-aware of reason's capacity, of reason's power, of our supersensible destiny, our supersensible vocation, the supersensible vocation of the mind. Namely, that we have a capacity within us that's not determined by sense, by sensation. And thereby, this is also, see the second critique, the source of our capacity for morality. So this is why he can draw this connection between the sublime and a sort of awakening of reason to its capacity for morality. Do you want to ask another question?
Is it because reason can understand more than imagination? Is it because imagination gets altered because it is overwhelmed, and reason can see past it, that reason becomes like hierarchically more than imagination?
Strictly speaking, I don't think imagination understands, even for Kant. It just has a role, which is to be the faculty of sensation, to create for us these thinkable instances of thinkable unified instances of perception. Certain things in the natural world trouble that and prevent that capacity from realizing itself. It matters, I think, a little bit how we describe that. Like someone like Lyotard will insist that's a type of failure of the imagination, a type of humiliation of the imagination. I think that for Kant, it just comes to its limits. It can't conceptualize or can't come up with an adequate presentation for something like the Grand Canyon just because of the scale. And it just sort of discovers its limits, and that reason takes over and it plays a larger role in the construction of those experiences. And we realize there that the mind is contributing quite a lot to experience that could not have come from the natural world. And Kant, I didn't mention this, but Kant makes the rather startling claim at this point that actually what's sublime is the human mind, nothing in nature, and certainly nothing in art. He doesn't think that there's anything great enough in art to merit the name sublime. It's really the human mind that's sublime. Please.
In relation to this conversation about sublime, for one of the few things that I've been presented with, that I think it's what we're talking about, which is capitalism. And so I'm wondering then, could it sort of fit into that sort of moment where my imagination sort of really can't reach, it sees its limits, and then reason sort of is able to sort of projected out as an idea.
Yeah, are people around here reading Friedrich Jameson that I'm not aware of? Because this is sort of
Yes, I'm sorry.
that's his thesis, is that there's the postmodern sublime is really capital because it's these completely unthinkable forces and social relations that boggle the mind. Sure. I guess that's a helpful contribution. I'm not denigrating yours. I guess Jameson's a helpful contribution. I don't know what the point of social theory that announces at the outset that it's not going to provide much of an explanation. What the point of that would be, honestly. That is to say, I don't see the utility of trying to conceptualize social phenomenon, which we're attempting to analyze in a cognitive way, under an aesthetic term, which is about indeterminacy, about the breakdown of sense. I don't understand the purpose of that from the start. particularly when we are capable of articulating the ways in which our own fallible, limited efforts will fail or could be inadequate to something like capital. Like, that seems like a much more coherent, intelligent project to me. But okay, it seems like there's a desire to address the connection between aesthetics and capital in some way. So let's maybe think of a way to do that succinctly. Like, is there a question? What I would say is I'm trying to pick up in my resisting a lot of the recent tendencies in aesthetics and art theory, particularly on the questions of the politics of aesthetics. I'm trying to resist the tendency to make art responsible for everything in this world. That is to say, like, I don't think art always has to be tackling that question, or that's the most important thing for it to be doing all of the time, which is not to say that it doesn't have its place, just that we have to analyze and be very critical of where these ideas come from, why they're coming to the fore now. I think it's more symptomatic of how problematic the realm of the political has become, that we're posing these questions about, or trying to pose these questions about the nature of capital within the context of art institutions and within the context of art practices.
But it seems to me, isn't it because, like, philosophy sort of shirked its responsibility there?
I don't know about that.
I mean, well, because it seems like you see the rise of it when you also see other disciplines withdrawing.
Speaking about my own discipline, I think there have been quite a number of really good attempts to articulate the specific nature of, if you like, postmodern capital or late capital. I'm thinking of the work of David Harvey, maybe Frederick Jameson, Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, books like that.
They also, I think, are on the fringes of your discipline.
Yeah, so am I, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that they don't exist. I just think that the core of the discipline seems to move away from some of the sort of place it held, perhaps.
Well, within the North American context, that's true, and that's true for all sorts of very locatable, describable, historical and political reasons, namely that a lot of politically engaged philosophers were systematically deprived of their employment opportunities during the McCarthy era, and the discipline of American philosophy never fully recovered from that. It's not true of philosophy as it's practiced in Latin America or philosophy as it's practiced in Europe, like where there's a much more, and it's certainly not true of philosophy since its inception, in which there was always a connection with politics.
Yeah,
But I think it's a failure.
Say is that the connection with art, like art sort of feeling that responsibility, perhaps, hadn't existed in the same way.
I think that we've come to a point where art is expected to carry too much water. Like, I don't think art can carry all the water of our politics, and it's symptomatic of a failure of political organization, political activism, and the political imagination within this country. And that as artists, you do well to think whether you really want to take on all those responsibilities. Because I think that, honestly, I think that the creation of moments of play, of moments of reverie, of moments of beauty, is political enough, or is a prompting enough to something which would then be political. And that it's never helpful to completely collapse the political into the aesthetic. That's what my position is about. Please.
I'm curious about how some of these definitions of aesthetics might apply to design as a space that's a bit different from art. I wonder if you've thought about that, or I just wonder how design kind of fits into your theory.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk more with you about this and think more about it.
Especially because you started off talking about how things that are defined as aesthetic are separated from the
And from use.
Yeah, and design deals with use in the everyday, or it can choose to.
Right.
And does that automatically make it not an aesthetic thing?
I would like to say no, and the reason would be simple, is that the aesthetic is the idea for a way of relating to the content of one's own experience differently. That is to say, in terms of this question, is it pleasing? And therefore, it's still possible to relate to something from the everyday, something which is completely practical and useful in terms of that question. We're just asking a different question of it. Now, so we're asking, about something which is useful. For the moment, for the sake of a thought experiment, abstract from everything you know to be its end, its purpose, its use, its utility, its function, and evaluate its appearance. Do you like it? Now, you might tell me that's not a very good design aesthetics, right? Because utility is, something that's integral to the nature of the thing, and we could end up with, very badly designed, irresponsible objects as a result. But I do think it has its place. I wouldn't want to say that question should determine what can be designed or should be designed, but that it has a role to play. It's a moment we can have with those objects, like where we can just appreciate their manifest beauty.
Opened a can of worms from last time when we were talking about Duchamp and even for someone like Jeff Koons, who Duchamp takes a urinal, puts it on a pedestal, then it's aesthetic. Koons puts a vacuum cleaner on a pedestal, and it's aesthetic. And I'm really curious about that kind of shift from basically designing every day to aesthetic.
Yeah, I don't have an answer to this, which does keep me up at night, is that sometimes, I don't think this is addressing your question directly, that sometimes utility itself is very beautiful, or at least it's come to be so for us, talking about our cultural conditioning. It's come to be so for us today in the 21st century world. It's something that works extraordinarily well and efficiently, has a type of beauty in it itself. That seems to resist or be at the very limits of the way in which the aesthetic, as it's been articulated in these texts, can talk about. And I think that's maybe the next question for people interested in the intersection of design and aesthetics to think about, is how to conceptualize that phenomenon exactly. I quibble a little bit with what you say, though. I don't think that that because Duchamp exhibits a piece of plumbing in this way, or Jeff Koons takes a household in this way, it makes it aesthetic. I think what they're inheriting, or what they're symptomatic of, is a transformation within the content, or within the concept of art itself, according to which the subject matter of art has been rendered irrelevant. And this, if you take a long-term view of this question, what can be the subject or content of art, neither Duchamp nor Jeff Koons are all that interesting. Like, these are things that had already taken place within 19th century French literature, in realism, for example, like wherein kitchens and warehouses and train stations were presented as the subject matter of art. So this, for me, the shock of those things has already taken place many years before. Please. I think are you asking me, like, which, to what should we assign historical explanatory force, to artistic projects or the theoretical sources in which they're articulated in? Is that what you're asking?
Well, I think like maybe the question is, how radical can an aesthetic be if it's sort of predicated on a certain like understanding of art history that is a narrative that was constructed in a certain way
Yeah.
for certain aims. That is, I think that's more like the tension for me, and just like it seems like it's actually not that radical. It seems like it really depends on sort of the status quo understanding of this progression that, you know, yeah. I don't know.
Well, I have to figure out more what you're talking about specifically, but I don't think that's the case with Kant. Like, Kant is very clearly not informed by the history of art, or by much in art at all, actually.
I guess I'm more wondering what yours.
That's not the case for someone like Hegel, though. Like, comes a little bit after Kant, who's very, very much in dialogue with art history, and really trying to provide a theoretical ground for that very linear, progressivist understanding of art history that's developing in Germany at that time. But not so with Kant. And, you know, we could talk about this in more detail, but there are a number of really startling places in Kant where I would defy you to tell me he is not inventing modern art well before the modernists. He's talking about the way in which certain underwater plants and sea fish, because of their abstract patterns, look like art. You know, this is well before anyone thinks to make abstract art. Well before anyone thinks to make abstract art, Kant says that the paradigmatic form of beauty is designs a la grecque on wallpaper. These completely formal, non-signifying, sinewy lines on wallpaper, you know, Kant holds up as the very paradigm of beauty. These kinds of textual events or textual positivities, I think, are what provide the grounds for a new sensibility which will emerge in what is typically understood as modernism. And, you know, it would be too much to give Kant all the credit. I mean, there are a number of other historical influences that we would have to pick apart, but I do think he's a very privileged location, particularly given how influential that text was so quickly within very avant-garde circles, right? I mean, that text is picked up immediately by people like Schiller, by people like the Jena Romantics, and becomes absolutely essential for the way in which the so-called modern arts understand themselves.